Right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Today, we have Dr. Francesca Soliman from Edinburgh Napier University. Thank you, Francesca, for being here today. Francesca joined Edinburgh Napier University as lecturer in criminology in 2021, shortly after submitting her PhD thesis at the University of Edinburgh. So she very recently just left us. We are very sad, but very happy for her. Francesca's research examines the social harms linked to processes of borderisation, with a particular focus on the impact of border performance on remote island communities at the external margins of the European Union. Francesca's work seeks to further develop the emerging discipline of zemiology as a tool to analyze the wider impact of border policies, but also to advance critical approaches towards states' roles in constructing and addressing social problems more in general. Francesca will speak for roughly 20-25 minutes, and then after that, we will allow for you the opportunity for a Q&A session and discussion towards the end, who my colleague Mia will moderate. Today, other conveners of the Criminology Reading Group today here is Daniela and also Jay. But yes, without further ado, Francesca, I will stop sharing the screen and you can take over.
Thank you very much, MJ. Let me see if I can indeed take over. There we go. Right, are the slides nice and visible? Yes, excellent. Well, hello everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar names and see familiar faces. Very grateful to have been invited here today to talk a little bit about my research. In fact, what I will talk about today is not my PhD research as a whole, but I will focus on the social impact the environmental impact of borderisation, focusing on the specific case of Lampedusa. So this is an article I'm working on at the moment. It draws from some of my findings of my PhD research. So I will tell you a little bit more about the project as a whole to give you some context. So as MJ said, my work looks at the intertwined national and supranational sovereignties that are at work at the Euro-Mediterranean border. So key legislation such as the Schengen Agreement have transformed this border over the last couple of decades, and islands like Lampedusa have become preferred sites for the identification and containment of irregular migrants crossing the sea from the North African coast. So migrant reception has become gradually institutionalized and integrated with securitization and control, with the growing involvement of EU agencies such as Frontex. So these processes of borderisation inevitably have a social impact. To quote Simmel, the border is not a spatial fact with sociological consequences, it's a sociological fact that forms itself spatially. So I adopt a zemiological approach, so a social harm-based framework, to try and untangle these complex social, but also economic, political, historical facts that constitute a border and understand whether these cause social harms to border communities. As you can see, environmental concerns were not on my radar at all at the beginning of this project. I knew that the idea of social harm casts a wide net, and I embarked on my research, which was an ethnography of Lampedusa with as open a mind as possible. But what I am presenting today effectively was a completely unexpected finding, and it poses a bit of a conceptual challenge. It seems necessary at this point to give you a picture of what Lampedusa is. Most people will not necessarily be familiar with it. It's an island here, a small sandy rock that's about 20 square kilometers or 7.8 square miles for those who think in those terms. And it's situated in the central Mediterranean, just between Tunisia and Sicily. So it is an Italian territory, so it's part of the European Union, but it lies a lot closer to the North African coast. And it's home to a population of about 6,000 people who until a couple of decades ago lived a remarkably isolated experience, living mostly of fishing. Most of the island, aside from the small town area where everybody lives, is a site of community importance as defined by the European Commission Habitats Directive. And it's a special protection area under the European Union Directive on the Conservation of Wild Birds. So this is because the island is an important pit stop for migratory birds on their way up from Africa. And this includes many globally endangered species like the Eleonora's falcon, which sadly is not the falcon in this picture, even though I thought so for a very long time. It's also home to a healthy insect population, with some species being found only here, nowhere else in the world, like this chubby cricket that's in the middle of the slide. The waters that surround the island and its sister islands in this tiny archipelago are also part of a large marine protected area, and a large nature reserve on the south coast of the island protects one of the last known nesting sites of the loggerhead sea turtle in the whole of Europe. So Lampedusa also hosts a world-leading veterinary hospital. It's dedicated to the rescue and rehabilitation of sea turtles that are injured by marine debris, usually lost fishing gear. And here they developed a revolutionary type of surgery that increased the survival rate for turtles who ingest fishing hooks from 5% to 95%. That's one of the patients at the hospital in that tank there. I think at the time of my visit, there were only 4 or 5, but during the summer season, they can go into several dozens. So the island's natural environment and its reputation as a wild, relatively uncontaminated place have made it popular with tourists in recent years. But this popularity largely relies on the continuous publicity that's afforded to the island whenever there's a migration-related event on the news. So importantly, as I said earlier, Lampedusa is a borderized space. So what do I mean by that? Borderization is a term that's often used to describe the militarization of borders or the building of infrastructure that prevents mobility, like the border wall. None of that applies to Lampedusa. This is an island, so the sea is the border wall. And there is no need for checkpoints to determine whether someone has arrived regularly or irregularly. There's no international flights. Irregular migrants can only arrive by boat, and they are easily intercepted, whether far out at sea or when they arrive on land. At that point, they're taken to the island's hotspot facility, which is here in this picture. And here they are identified, fingerprinted, and initially screened by Frontex agents who try to determine who can be immediately deported without even entering the asylum system. So border states such as Italy work as buffer zone for the rest of Europe. More than a sorting space, the external border is a space of containment. So this has made islands like Lampedusa the ideal spaces for border management. Not only they make informal confinement easy, because you can keep people on the island for months, there's nowhere they can go, but they also allow a high degree of information control to institutional actors. So you can control the narratives that are presented to the outside world quite easily. It's important to remember that this process of borderization on islands like Lampedusa is not an accident of geography. It's not just because Lampedusa is where it is. It's the result of conscious policy choices. So for example, the presence of a hotspot means that the migrants who are intercepted at sea are then taken here for the screening and for further confinement. The number of migrants taken to Lampedusa changes over time, depending not necessarily on the departures, but on the border needs of the day or other factors that might influence the choice of border agents to move migrants elsewhere. So the presence of this formalized reception system also determines the choice of Lampedusa as a destination by the migrants themselves, because they know that authorities will transfer them to the mainland. Again, this is another point to remember. Sea borders are difficult to cross irregularly compared to land borders. It's very unlikely to escape detention when you are on an island. So it is the presence of a formal border infrastructure that makes Lampedusa a destination for irregular migration. In fact, there are other Italian islands that lie even closer to Tunisia than Lampedusa, but they do not have the same reception system or connection to the mainland. They're not borderized, and therefore they're not attractive points of entry for migrants, and they're not chosen as destination by authorities who intercept the migrants at sea. To give a bit of context on the scale of the migration we're talking about, over the past 2 decades, estimates are that about half a million people have crossed the Mediterranean to reach Lampedusa. And we know that tens of thousands have died trying, but the true numbers of those who have died will never be known, because we normally rely on survivors to tell the rescuers that there were fatalities, or that they know of a boat that didn't make it. Otherwise, it just is never found out. Right, so this was the necessary context to understand what I'm going to talk about next. So as I said, most migrant boats are intercepted at sea. So usually, sometimes further out in the Channel of Sicily by Frontex army assets, sometimes NGO ships. If you're close enough to the coast of the island, it will be the local Coast Guard, as was the case on this image. So the authorities will then transfer the migrants from the vessel they arrived in into the speedboat or ship or whatever they arrived in, or whatever the authorities are driving, and then transport them to the island. So normally Lampedusa's residents were quite reluctant to talk about the migration issues in general. But quite a few times I was approached by people whispering to me in a conspiratorial tone, you know, ask people, ask what happens to the boats. So an example is this quote here from an interview with a resident by the name Sirocco. All my respondents I anonymized by giving them the names of Mediterranean winds. And they told me, when you see a speedboat carrying migrants, you need to wonder where their boat is or the rubber dinghy. So in theory, migrant boats should be seized as evidence of immigration offenses by authorities. But Sirocco's point here is clear. If the Coast Guard, military, NGO ships are not towing the migrant's boat, then what happened to it? The answer is quite simple, and it was given by another respondent who were named Ponente. As I said, it's easier to sink them in the open sea because there are so many of them. If you took them here, you'll end up with thousands of boats. How would you dispose of them? How much would it cost? Just let the sea dispose of them. So we already know that when there is a shipwreck, the boat will sink and remain at the bottom of the sea. There was at least one exception to this, a major shipwreck in 2015 when Italian authorities decided to recover the wreck because they wanted to get access to the hundreds of bodies that were trapped inside. But generally, a boat will sink in the middle of the Mediterranean. A lot of the time, nobody will know where it is. However, even when there isn't a shipwreck, when migrants are intercepted, the boats also are often left to sink. So Ponente suggests this is because it would be too onerous to take them all to land and dispose of them. So is this a deliberate decision, and if so, who makes it? So residents were reluctant to point fingers to the point of contradicting themselves sometimes, like in this quote, no, they are left adrift, they're not scuttled. Well, actually, I saw scuttling. Scuttling is the deliberate sinking of a boat. I saw them, but I do not have evidence, so it's pointless for me to tell you about it, but I did see them, and I saw them set fire to the boats. So Ponente would not elaborate on who they was, but we can easily guess from what they said earlier about the cost effectiveness of leaving boats to sink that they were referring to border authorities. So fishermen would tell me that they often encountered empty migrant boats left adrift at sea, sometimes partially scuttled. So the fact that the boats were empty suggests that a rescue operation had taken place and the boat had been left behind. Of course, we also need to consider that in some cases, it's possible that migrants have scuttled the boat themselves, perhaps to force a rescue operation if authorities were close by, or also that the boats being barely seaworthy in the first place, by the time migrants were rescued, often they would also already be damaged beyond repair. In any case, for whatever reason, a decision is made at some point to leave the boat behind. So what happens to these wrecks? They eventually sink to the seafloor where they're dragged by trawlers' nets. If the wreck is small enough, the fishers will lift their nets after a few hours of fishing, find out that they've been ripped, that they caught no fish, and they need to spend the rest of the working day trying to repair the damage. When the wreck is larger or maybe still floating below the water surface, then the fishing boats risk sinking themselves. One such event had happened recently when I was on the island. So he hit the wreck and seriously damaged his boat. He was taking on water, but he was close to the harbor, so he made it. He survived. So these are quite dangerous encounters. The fishing fleet on Lampedusa share the GPS coordinates of the wrecks that they encounter to try and minimize these incidents. But the wrecks keep moving along the seafloor, and there are new ones appearing closer and closer to the coast. So these type of encounters happen, or at least the breaking of the nets happen on a daily basis to someone on the fleet. So these wrecks not only endanger human life, but also dangerous to the environment. Everything they contain ends up in the sea. fuel, batteries, oil, any debris or rubbish carried on board, paint, everything. In some cases, however, the boats did arrive to Lampedusa, whether because they were brought back by the authorities or because the migrants had arrived to the island independently. This was more often the case for smaller boats. So in this case, they will get moored or hamassed into the harbor, where they will be just abandoned for years often and end up polluting the harbor waters. So as Ponente explained to me again, so the boats contain obviously polluting substances. If there were barrels of fuel on board, then the locals would just steal them and use them for their own boat. But the fuel in the tank would remain inside, the oil in the engine. As Ponente said, a 100 horsepower engine has at least 15 liters of oil inside that ends up in the sea. So does the ship. Battery, any other material. So how does this end in the sea then? Because any boat that is not maintained will eventually sink. And in the case of the boats amassed in the harbor, the frequent coastal storms just break them up, and then the debris washes out at sea. There is so much of this debris and broken up boats in the harbor, a continuous supply, that it has become the prime material used by a local artist who's become famous for making these crosses that mark the graves of unnamed migrants in the local cemetery. One of these crosses is actually held in the British Museum as well. So the artist can't touch the boats that are in the harbor because these were seized by authorities as evidence. So they're off limits. They are military property, strangely. So he just waits for bad weather to break up the boats, and then he just picks up the pieces after each bout of bad weather. At that point, it is no longer evidence, it's just marine debris, just rubbish, so he can just pick it up. In recent years, migrant boats have tended to get smaller, but in the early 2010s, I would say, there were much larger vessels arriving, usually because they were doing the longer trip from the Libyan coast. So at the time, they would be uplifted from the harbor because there was no space to accommodate them, and then piled up in what would then be known as Lampedusa's boat cemeteries, as the one in the picture here. So some can still be seen in a couple of sites around the island, although there's only few boats left now. They used to be in the hundreds. So this is the only example of a managed disposal of boats on Lampedusa. So how did it work? Well, not great, according to Levant. So they would just dump the boats with bulldozers, let them break down. They will fall apart with all the waste still inside. Nothing was removed from the boat before they were piled up. They will not remove waste, organic waste. Remember that each of these boats housed hundreds of people for a journey that took easily 72, 80, 90 hours. Clothes, you have no idea of what's left on a migrant boat after disembarkation. And they became a haven for mice, and maybe some wily guy would go and dump their own waste there too. Because when you create a dump, and the implication here is that obviously everybody will contribute to it, dumping their own stuff. So in addition to polluting the sea around Lampedusa, migrant boats were allowed to pollute the land as well, letting noxious substances seep into the soil, accumulating garbage, and periodically these dumps will also be set on fire, releasing even more pollution into the air. So the reason for these fires is linked to the disposal mechanisms of these boats, which will periodically be put to tender through emergency mechanisms, and then these will be carried out without complying with environmental regulations. So the same mechanism regulated the occasional removal of boats from the harbor. In fact, I'm speaking of the past tense, but this is still the case today. So in a nutshell, the boats are allowed to amass in the port or on land until this triggers an environmental crisis that is obvious and visible. So there's too much oil in the port or too much waste in the dump. So at that point, a state of emergency is declared. The administration is allowed to award a public contract without a call for tender. And the usual environmental protection regulations can be suspended because of the emergency. So for example, this allowed a giant boat dump to be established in the middle of a natural reserve in the early 2000s. So the move at the time was challenged by national environmentalist organizations, which obtained the seizure of the site pending investigation. And then there were years of legal wrangling, and the matter was settled by arson, and the boats went up in smoke on Boxing Day 2008. So that's been the repeating cycle ever since. Now, before I make my final points on the links between borderisation and environmental harms, I should also point out that rubbish disposal is generally a sore point on Lampedusa. Fly tipping is a widespread problem. The reasons are complex. Largely, though, they are linked to structural issues like maladministration, endemic corruption, and the exponential increase in consumption that's been brought forward by the arrival of tourism, which has transformed the island's economic model in recent years. Even allowing for this caveat, it is undeniable that the borderisation of Lampedusa has caused long-term environmental damage to the island. So this damage is both foreseeable and preventable. It is inextricably linked to the border's perpetual creation, of cyclical states of emergency. So these are designed to decrease scrutiny for border-related activities in general and to allow quick responses to any change in circumstances. But in this case, they also perpetuate environmental damage to the point that any measure that's then taken to ameliorate it relies first on reaching a crisis point that has to be manufactured. So that border-related activities are the prerogative of state and supranational agents mean that there is also limited local accountability. So there's been many attempts over the years by local residents to try and address these issues quite early on through sustainable education initiatives, or at some point the whole fishing community proposed they would voluntarily help dispose of the boats in a safe manner, clean all the paint, get rid of all the rubbish, empty in the tanks, and then sink in the material in a controlled manner so that the location of the wrecks will be known and there will be no disposal of polluting substances in the sea. None of these initiatives were ever allowed. So based on my wider finding from the wider project, I suggest that this is part of a wider silencing power that's exercised in a borderized environment like Lampedusa. It disempowers local actors and it stifles any attempted resistance. Importantly, local initiatives to tackle the environmental harms of tourism, for example, were more successful. For example, the whole city banned, city is a big word, the island banned, for example, single-use plastics, and they took other measures to reduce the amount of rubbish created by tourism. So it is the border that is a barrier here to environmental restoration. So environmental harm is frequently examined as one of the structural harms that are produced by neoliberal societies. In the case of Lampedusa, though, we have something different. It shows that it's the inherently zemiogenic nature of borders that does not affect not only only those that are targeted by them, but also all of those who occupy border spaces and their natural environment. So the damage here is linked to the nature of border management. It's more hidden and difficult to quantify, but that doesn't make it any less deserving of attention. The question remains of how we conceptualize this type of harm and how we address it. So rather than the harms of consumption and consumerism that we're used to talking about, this kind of environmental harm perhaps is more closely related to environmental harm caused by routine military operations, which tends to be justified as a matter of national interest and for which there are exceptions routinely made to environmental protections. So the next question is, how do we address this? Well, criminalization is bound to be ineffective because by exploiting the emergency exceptions that are written within environmental law, the state is in fact not violating any regulations, but rather they are being followed to the letter. So I suggest here instead that to understand these harms, they should not be looked at in isolation, but considered as part of the wider zemiogenic nature of borders and the wider nature of social harms in a borderized space. So as such, they are an intrinsic, if hidden, consequence of the routinization of border crisis, and it's a wider social harm approach remain the most suitable lens to highlight them and understand their nature. Right? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That was very fascinating, and I'm very happy to hear more about your research. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Mia Farton, who will moderate the Q&A discussion part.
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating project that I hadn't heard very much about. So thank you so much for presenting. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand with the function. And if you want to type it into the chat box, which I can read out, please feel free to do that. Does anyone have any questions immediately? Okay, I'll start off with one that I had a reflection on. In your research, did you feel like, you mentioned that you faced a lot of resistance and it was harder to interview through your methodology and to gain a response in that way? What sort of measures did you use to overcome that? And do you think that will affect like the quality of your research that you produced?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's something I could overcome to a certain degree. Because a lot of the resistance I encountered on the island was the result of decades of media and academic attention on the island, and residents talking about experiences of being followed by people trying to ask them questions. I saw someone giving an interview to 5 different people at the same time, like a reverse focus group. It is quite bizarre, the level of attention that some residents are under. Other parts of the population, however, are not serial responders. So what I tried to do was to have several strategies to reach people. I used social media, I used different contacts that tried to give me a mapping of which parts of the island communicate with each other, who was more likely to have spoken to researchers in the past, which, to be honest, is quite easy to understand because a lot of researchers did a terrible job anonymizing people. So after a while, I could actually recognize the people who had given interviews in the past. So with that and with time, I did end up reaching some people who had never really spoken to anybody before. So I make a lot of caveats in my research about the possible limitations of this, but also the fact that this is a finding in itself. It speaks to the socially harmful practices of much academia. And it speaks to the dangers of over-research and the way we think about over-research as just something that we need to overcome so we can collect more data, rather than something that points to a more fundamental issue about how we do research and how we think about, even in our ethics procedures, about the harm that we can cause to participants. We only think about what we are doing as an individual. We don't really think about the cumulative impact of our presence when so many have been there before us, how that big presence has affected the social reality of the island, and therefore our presence also does that and what we're leaving behind. So in many ways, it was a challenge, but it was also like a whole chapter that came out of this. It also meant I was insulted a lot, and some quite scary dudes as well, with some heavily sexualized threats. So it wasn't always comfortable, but useful to get like a true idea. If I had just followed, I guess, the beaten path and just speaking to people who normally speak to others, I wouldn't have seen it. I wouldn't have had the same picture. So yeah,
that sounds fascinating. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. MJ, you have a question?
Yes. So what I was going to ask was, so do you know what the situation in Lampedusa is now after the pandemic? Is there any more? What's the number of migrant crossings that is occurring? The environmental harm, or these initiatives that you were talking about, have you heard anything about those? Are they still not in the pipeline? Or do you know what the situation is, more or less?
Yeah, I don't know numbers, because you get anecdotal, like you get kind of daily statistics, like, okay, 23 has arrived today. So as far as migrant arrivals, the first year of the pandemic, there was a huge drop. And then it was kind of same as before. So not much has changed from that point of view. I'm not sure what impact the pandemic has had on the island now. For the first year or so, because it's an island, it was very easy to identify cases and isolate them. I presume that remains the case now, as of today. But I don't think that's had a huge impact on migration-related concerns. It's probably had quite a big impact on tourism, which is a whole different problem for the island itself. And environmental, yes, the measures that were suggested, yeah, nothing's ever come of those. In fact, I feel like there are other environmentally related causes and reasons for advocacy. Groups were advocating for change on the island. For example, the issue of military installations. It's a very small island, but there are very powerful radars put there by NATO, and then the Navy has their own, the Coast Guard has their own, the Finance Police has their own, Carabinieri have one, police have one. So you have a cumulative effect of loads and loads and loads of radiation, which has unknown effect on individual health, because the population is too small for an epidemiological study. We know it probably has an impact on insects and the flight of birds, but there's also a lot of secrecy around. There used to be a very strong and kind of powerful resistance to these, and it's kind of died out in the years. And something that I conceptualize in my thesis as another consequence of the border. So the fact that so much of the island's economy relies on tourism, and the tourism relies on the island having a good reputation. Activism, resistance, all of these things, they highlight problems on the island that the rest of the population don't want people to see because they're scared that the tourists will run away. So there's this constant precarity here on the island, living from year to year, and because they can never really implement long-standing change because the border gets in the way. And that means that everybody on the island is always hostage of the rest of the community. You can't really raise your voice too much. And this kills down any type of resistance. So all of these initiatives, they just tend to die down and eventually just become symbolic, really. So yeah, nothing's changed for now. And I don't think there will be positive change in the future either.
Jean-Pierre?
Hi, Francesca. Thank you for that
Okay.
interesting talk. I was just curious to hear more about the social dynamics that take place on the island. Do the people that work for immigration control, do they live on the island, or do they just come in for the day type thing?
Yeah, so, right. So the presence of a border brings hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to the island. So you have lots of law enforcement who live on the island, but live either in barracks or hotels. They have no interaction with the rest of the community.
Yeah, okay.
They come from outside. They will stay a few months, go to the beach a lot, and then leave. The same goes for people who work in the hotspot. Sometimes local people also find jobs there, but strangely, whenever there's because the numbers keep changing, so the number of people who are employed keeps changing. So the people who are locals tend to be fired first, and then the other people are just redeployed somewhere else. And then you have Frontex agents. Again, they live on the island, but they are more akin to tourists. They have no social interaction with the island. So yeah, so you have a big border economy that's kind of bringing all these people who will stay for weeks and months at a time, but without any kind of social integration with the resident community whatsoever. So it's like you have three communities on the island: the local residents, the people who work for the border, and the migrants themselves, and they're all separate.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Going off that last question, do you think that the different dynamics of people coming to the island, i.e. different actors, have a large impact on how this has been managed? And going off that, how do you think the European Union and Frontex more centrally can respond to this challenge going forward?
So yes, the number of people who work for the border, let's say, there were suggestions, for example, that the one of the reasons that perpetuate these states of crisis that are that come into existence is that sometimes people who maybe own a very big hotel and they know that the tourist season is very short because it's limited by when the flights happen. So you have a whole island that works for like 2 or 3 months a year, and then you need to eat the rest of the 12 months. So if you have a big hotel, maybe you will make some noise about migrants. Maybe you will complain that migrants have been running amok and stealing, and we need more police on the island. If this reaches the news, then the Italian state will react by sending more people to the island. And then suddenly the emergency is stopped. There's more police walking around the island doing nothing really in particular. And those who have these big hotels and big restaurants have an income again because they get these massive contracts from state agents. I don't know how much that's based on fact necessarily. It's something that many on the islands were thinking and saying. You have a strange situation when you have such a small community where everybody knows everyone and seems to know everybody's business. At the same time, you talk to them and you also realize they don't know things that have happened on the island. Like they don't even know whether there are migrants on the island at that time or not. So then you start thinking, oh, hang on, maybe people say things so confidently, but they don't actually know. Maybe it's just speculation. So it seems that the whole winter economy being based on the presence of the border, there's evidence to suggest that that has influenced how much and how often some of the more powerful voices on the island would cry for emergency. That had happened just on the winter before I arrived, for example. So it was something I was able to observe, let's say, its effect. But here you also have a division between national forces and EU agencies like Frontex. So when I was on the island, the Frontex presence was quite small because really they only had, I think, one supervisor and a couple of screeners. It was a very small team. And it actually took me a long time to find them as well. So these responses are at a national level. So the Italian state will send police, law enforcement, et cetera, to manage the crisis or to manufacture the crisis, or whichever way we interpret it. But on an EU level, the involvement is a lot more limited. What's important for the EU agencies is simply that any arrival is identified and that they are not let to the mainland without being identified for the sole purpose of preventing secondary movement of asylum seekers to other states. So I think your question was, what could the EU do about it? Well, they could have probably done a lot many years ago. At this point, the question is, it's difficult because what the EU is doing, so the securitization of the border, for example, with its consequences, is kind of a necessity for the constitutional order of the bloc. So if you want to maintain control-free Schengen movement, you have to limit movement of the external borders. The two have to come together, and so do the treaties say from the very beginning, that the two are interlinked. So I'm not sure how far we will need to go make sure that, like, I think there are competing interests there that are not easily reconciled. And the pressure that is put on states, border states like Italy and Greece and Spain, necessarily comes from also the individual pressure that northern nation states put on the EU as an institution. So again, you have the EU as an institution and the EU as a number of states that have competing interests. So I'm not sure, the situation is far too complex. Definitely one measure would be to stop letting people drown at sea, so that you can, and acknowledge that this is an existing issue, not a state of crisis. This is something that's an issue that's created by our lack of preparation and lack of willingness to face what is simply a fact of our globalized world, and actually put in place measures, funding, instruments for the disposal of boats, but also preventing the irregular movement in the first place by allowing more regular travel. So the measures that would actually ameliorate this have little to do with Lampedusa at all. They go a lot beyond.
Yeah, I agree. Juana, sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, I apologize.
No, that's right, it's Juana. Hi, Francesca, I want to say thank you so much, it's so interesting. I did have a question. So your research, that was very interesting. It's quite like, I feel like it sometimes it sort of like overlaps a bit with mine, because I'm also interested in like islands. But I wanted to ask, what were the challenges you faced when carrying out research on an island specifically? And from what you're telling me, Lampedusa seems a little bit quite remote. I'm just curious about, yeah, what were that? And what did you find helpful when preparing for that field work as well?
Yeah, it is very remote and nothing prepared me for it. And I was quite hit sideways by it. I kept a blog while I was there, where I was trying to collect my experience of being there while trying to do research, but also the things that I was finding odd about being in a place like that. And there were many. Living in a remote island where you have inconsistent transport. I got there at the end of winter because I was trying to avoid the tourist season. So there were very few flights. Everything on the island arrives by boat, by ferry. So food, any kind of supplies. Sometimes the ferry doesn't come for whatever reason. So you go to the shop to try and buy some food, and there's just a few things. You go home with nothing because there was nothing there. You go back the day after, there's even fewer, and then there's fewer, and then there's fewer, and then you start buying the moldy tomatoes that you saw on the first day because there's probably not going to be anything else. And it's a strange contrast. It kind of makes you realize how weird it is that we have everything so available. But also you're very conscious of the fact that you mustn't get sick because there's no hospital there. You notice things like lots of stray animals, and at first you're annoyed at the people. You think, oh, these people have no respect for animals. And then you realize, well, there's no vet here. There's no facilities to make this any different. There's no facilities even for humans. Everything is kind of informal. So the police are there, but not really, because they're not there for you. They're just there to control the migrants. So if someone follows you around the island and nobody else thinks this is weird, the police are definitely not going to do anything about that, because it's just, well, stop going out alone at night around an island. So it's are there schools? Yes, there's one school, elementary and middle school, but then you have to go to the mainland for high school. And if you are someone from a family who can afford to send you to university, then you'll move somewhere else for that. So these people who live with in these situations have a very different way of looking at things. And you kind of have to adapt to that. And sometimes they will do things that seem really bizarre, and you just don't get it because it's the nature of the kind of environment they live in. So it takes a very long time. It took me many weeks to get into that. And then whenever you meet someone on the island who is also from outside, the first thing they'll tell you is, how weird is this place? And you're like, yes, it's so weird. Can you imagine? Like, there's no, even the water from the taps is salty because it comes from a hole in the ground. And you don't know that until you make your tea for the first time. And then you're like, what? And then you realize you're not supposed to brush your teeth with the water that comes from the tap because it's not safe. Nobody's going to tell you that because it would never occur to them that you would be stupid enough to do that. So I don't know what would prepare you necessarily. Either you already know someone who lives in that environment and they also know what it's like outside of their environment, so they can tell you what is different about it, or you'll just learn that there in a very, very hard and painful way sometimes. And then at some point, everything seems normal to you, and that's the time to leave.
I think related to this question, Robert asked in the chat, with the oversampling of research going on the island, has this resulted in a secondary economy for the residents, i.e. paid compensation to partake in research, etc.?
Oh, that's very interesting. Strangely, no, but so not monetary compensation, but there is a compensation in visibility. So those who will more happily give you interviews, although only if you reach them through the right channels, are those who have a message to put across. So either because someone is promoting a book, but more often it's people who work in for local NGOs or local charities that look after migrants, and they have some sort of, they've built a presence for themselves over the years by responding to so many interviews and being in so many documentaries. They will have like a stack of DVDs and like, oh, I was in this film and I was in this film. So there's like an image economy, and sometimes you might be speaking to people, you might ask them a question, and this person is such a well-seasoned respondent, they will just not answer your question because they will answer a better question that they think you should have asked. So yeah, it's strange that nobody thought of asking for money, but I think they just assume that, you know, if I don't have the money to pay you, I just go and pay someone else. So perhaps in some ways this makes it even more exploitative, that people effectively get so little back from being disturbed so much. But some have learned to kind of use this exploitation to their own advantage. And because everybody has their own tiny business, if you live in a place like that and you've got a spare room, you're going to put it on Airbnb. So when you maintain this kind of context, and then you kind of make yourself someone who can be a point of contact for researchers, then people are going to give your name to other people who are coming to the island. So there is a kind of indirect possible monetary advantage. But mostly I found it to be ideological. So people who talked a lot about not wanting migrants, they were also less likely to want to talk to interviewers because they would just say, oh, you're just going to think I'm racist, so I'm not going to talk to you. Whereas those who were presenting themselves as promoters and, you know, saviors and humanitarian actors, even though informally, they would be more keen to talk to research and put forward this savior image of themselves. Sometimes it's quite transparent, sometimes a bit more insidious.
That's interesting. We have another question in the chat from Colin. Apologies again if I've said your name incorrectly. I'm just wondering if you were able to interview government officials while there. Are they willing to talk?
Hi, Colin. So without accidentally giving details away, I did speak to local politicians, people who were or had been involved in the local administration at different levels of power. So yes, again, each and every person that I interviewed, I had to chase like a lot. So these were people who were willing to talk, but not so readily available that you really had to use all of the social networks that you could to try and get someone to actually talk to you. Thankfully, it's a small island, so they will keep running into you. And at some point, they will just, if they said yes, then they will end up doing it. So yeah, so there was a willingness to talk, but also, especially for the people who are known outside of the island or are known because of their political activities, like more nationally, again, there is a message that they have to, that they wish to put forward. And sometimes, you know, they might be a bit guarded. In some cases, they perhaps will start very guarded and then somehow decide that I was on their side and then just keep talking, even though I didn't think I gave any indication that was what I was thinking. But yeah, generally, once you get your hands on them, figuratively speaking, people are willing to talk if you're willing to listen. So it was, once you got them there in the situation, it was easy enough to get a conversation starting. But yeah, again, you know, it's reaching the people that's difficult. And also because they get approached so much by so many people and they don't know what people's intentions really are. So lots of fear of being misrepresented.
Any final questions in the last couple minutes? Erica?
Yeah. Hi, Francesca. Thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. So I am probably going to do a little more research on Lampedusa and on African migration into Italy because I find it particularly interesting. And as you mentioned earlier, there's quite a lot of media coverage of the island and what's going on in the area. And because you did some deep research into what's happening locally and then more widely as well, and you went off the beaten path, I was wondering if you had any tips on how to deal with like the overwhelm of media coverage and how to basically approach it into a smart way, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but I don't know if I have a smart answer because I bundled my way through a lot of it. And if I look back, I'm not sure what I could have done differently to make it easier on myself mostly. So to go a bit outside of a beaten path, I would recommend using social media because it helps you reach more people. But at the same time, you have to be ready for like a lot of abuse. So see if it's worth it. And alternatively, if you know that you are spending time on Lampedusa and you're there long enough, you can try and ask the people you will be with, like anybody. You need to just spend a lot of time with people and listen, and don't really ask much of them. Don't really, make sure that you have a clear agenda, that they can see through you, they know what you want, and they'll know that you're not going to misrepresent what they're saying to you, but also that you're not always sitting there with a notepad taking note of everything they're saying just so that you can use it. People mostly, like they had this, I was told many times, you're just here for your own career. And to me, as a young PhD student, the idea of having a career was preposterous. I'm like, no, guys, I'm just trying to get through to the next year. But then, you know, on second thoughts, I'm like, you know what, they are right. They're seeing right through this. This is just career advancement for us. This is just papers that nobody's going to read. This is very little benefit in reality. So if you can have a clear idea of what benefit you actually can bring and give back to people, for me, making the issue of migrant boats known and talking about it is what people have asked me to do. And this is what I'm doing finally, and hoping to broadcast a bit more widely, because residents are, what they said, Liz, was they're too scared of talking about it because it sounds like they don't care about people, they just care about boats. And I think, well, maybe I have tools to put this forward in a more nuanced manner. Is it worth it for them? I don't know, but I would recommend having a clear idea of what benefits you can actually give and what you're going to do afterwards, and how you're going to help people with their actual problems, the ones that they actually face every day, not the ones that we see in media representations. I don't know if that helps in any way. Don't drink the water.
No, definitely. That's really interesting. Thank you so much.
Any final comments, questions? Is there anything you'd like to say, Francesca, to ask about anything you felt like you missed off the presentation that you'd like to explore in further detail?
Oh, I could go on for not hours, I could go on for days. So I think I will spare you all that. But thank you very much for coming. It's really been great to see so many people here today and to have the chance to talk about this.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for taking the time. And thank you to our audience who you've been brilliant and very, very interesting questions as well. And thank you also to my colleagues who also helped this happen. So Francesca's presentation will be available on YouTube in due course, but also keep checking our Twitter and our Facebook and for the next few events that are going to occur this semester. And if you want to be added to our mailing list, our email is in the chat, lawcrg@ed.ac.uk. Have a lovely weekend, I suppose, everyone, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.